My daughter told me she couldn't make it to my birthday because her husband had planned a surprise getaway. I understood, until I saw photos online of her and her mother, my ex-wife, celebrating with cake and gifts in the house I paid for. She had cut me out, completely. I didn't say a word. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. Before we continue, support us by clicking on the like button, tell us in the comments section where you are watching us from, and click on the subscribe button so that you don't miss our big story tomorrow. Now let me tell you what happened from the beginning. She won't make it, the waiter said gently, already reaching for the extra place setting like he'd rehearsed this moment before. I watched his hand hover, then hesitate, as if even he wasn't sure whether to clear it yet. My phone sat face up beside my plate, the screen still lit from her message. I'm so sorry, Dad. Mark planned a surprise getaway. I didn't know until today. The candle wax had started to bend inward, the flame leaning like it was tired of standing upright. I nodded at the waiter, gave him a tight smile, and told him it was fine. I told him we'd keep the seat open a little longer. The restaurant was louder than I remembered, or maybe I'd just grown less patient with noise. Laughter bounced off the walls, forks clinked against plates, and somewhere behind me a group sang an off-key birthday song for someone who wasn't eating alone. I picked up my phone again, reread her text, and typed "have fun. We'll celebrate another time." I didn't add a heart or a smiley face. I hit send, locked the screen, and folded my hands on the table like I was waiting for instructions. Outside the window, traffic crawled past, steady and indifferent, as if the world had other places to be. By the time the food arrived, I'd already decided how the night would go. I would eat. I would pay. I would go home. There would be no follow-up message from her, no sudden change of plans, no dramatic entrance with apologies and excuses. I'd been around long enough to recognize a closed door, even when it was disguised as politeness. Still, as I cut into my steak, I caught myself glancing up every time the door opened. That reflex annoyed me more than the empty chair. I should have known better, and part of me understood that this quiet disappointment was going to harden into something less forgiving if I let it linger too long. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed again, breaking the rhythm of knife and fork. It wasn't her. It was my sister, Linda. How's the birthday going? Did she surprise you? I stared at the message longer than necessary, aware of the irony sitting right there in her choice of words. I typed back, "Quiet night. Rain check," and slid the phone back onto the table. Even as I sent it, I felt the first pull of something heavier than disappointment. I didn't have a name for it yet, but I knew it wasn't going to pass on its own. It felt like the beginning of a decision I hadn't admitted I was already making. When I got home, the house greeted me with that particular kind of silence that only exists when you expect someone else to be there. I set my keys down, loosened my tie, and stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The birthday card I'd bought myself sat unopened on the counter, still in its envelope. I'd meant to throw it away earlier, but I hadn't. Instead, I poured a drink and carried it into the living room, sitting in the same chair I'd sat in every night since the divorce. That was when I told myself, quietly, deliberately, that this was just how things were now, and that understanding it would be easier than fighting it. I didn't realize then how expensive that understanding had already been. 2 days later, I was back at work, pretending the week was ordinary. Emails came and went, meetings blurred together, and my birthday receded into something I told myself I didn't care about. Around noon, my daughter finally called. I let it ring twice before answering. She sounded cheerful, a little rushed, already talking about the drive back and how Mark had outdone himself. I told her I was glad she'd had a good time. She thanked me for being so understanding. When the call ended, I sat there staring at my desk, aware that I'd just been praised for accepting something that hadn't been mine to accept in the first place. That afternoon, the bank notification came through like it always did. Monthly transfer completed. Same amount. Same date. Same quiet assurance that I was still useful, still dependable, still playing my part. I didn't react to it then. I just closed the notification and went back to work, telling myself there was no connection between the empty chair at dinner and the money leaving my account. But even as I told myself that, I felt the first crack in a routine I'd mistaken for stability. It occurred to me, briefly, that routines could be broken just as easily as promises, and that idea stayed with me longer than it should have. By that weekend, the house felt smaller. I cleaned rooms that didn't need cleaning, reorganized drawers that had been fine for years, and avoided the one thing I usually did without thinking, scrolling through my phone at night. On Sunday evening, as I sat down with a reheated dinner, the phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification from a social media app one rarely used anymore. You have new memories to look back on. I almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, I tapped the notification, telling myself I'd close it as soon as it opened. The first image took a second to register, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was too familiar. The angle was wrong, the lighting different, but the couch was unmistakable. I'd chosen it myself years ago, arguing about fabric and color in a store I couldn't remember the name of anymore. My stomach tightened as I swiped to the next photo. There was my daughter, smiling, holding a plate with a slice of cake. There was her mother, standing beside her, one arm around her shoulders. Balloons hovered in the background, and on the table was a gift bag I recognized because I'd bought a dozen just like it in bulk when she was in college. I didn't scroll any further. I didn't need to. The timestamp was enough. The location tag confirmed what I already knew. They hadn't been away. They'd been home. My home once. The one I'd paid for, maintained, and quietly lost. I set the phone down on the table, my appetite gone, my hands steady in a way that surprised me. I didn't feel anger yet. I felt something colder, something more precise. I understood, in that moment, that nothing about this had been accidental, and that I wasn't going to say a word. I recognized the living room before I recognized the faces, and that was the part that settled deepest in my chest. The angle was slightly off, the photo taken from near the hallway instead of the couch, but I would have known that room anywhere. The framed print above the fireplace was still there, slightly crooked the same way it had been the day I hung it. The lamp in the corner was one I'd replaced twice because her mother liked that particular shade of yellow light. Even before my eyes moved to my daughter's smile, something inside me had already accepted the truth. This wasn't coincidence, and it wasn't carelessness. This was deliberate. I set the phone down again, face down this time, like it might keep the image from burning itself deeper if I didn't look directly at it. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, even as I replayed her words from the night of my birthday. A surprise getaway. I repeated it in my head, testing the phrase for weakness, for some hidden explanation I'd missed. Maybe the photos were old. Maybe the app was wrong. Maybe I was doing that thing I'd promised myself I wouldn't do anymore, assigning intention where there might only be convenience. That justification lasted exactly as long as it took for my phone to buzz again. Another notification. Another photo added. This one wider, clearer. Balloons with happy birthday written across them in looping script. A cake I didn't recognize, but candles lit to the same number I'd blown out alone at a restaurant table 48 hours earlier. I picked the phone up again, scrolling slowly now, forcing myself to absorb every detail without flinching. The gift bags weren't random. I'd paid for those kinds of things for years, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, always without conditions. There was a familiarity to the scene that felt rehearsed, like a tradition I'd been quietly excluded from rather than something spontaneously thrown together. I noticed what wasn't there too. No sign of her husband. No suitcase in the corner. No indication of a rushed departure or late arrival. This wasn't a pit stop before a getaway. This was the destination. And the realization that followed wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was surgical. They hadn't just chosen to celebrate without me. They'd chosen to lie about it. The next morning, my daughter texted me like nothing had happened. Did you end up doing anything nice for your birthday? The question sat on my screen while I poured my coffee, steam curling up between us like a barrier. I didn't answer right away. I read it 3 times, paying attention to the casual tone, the ease with which she asked it. There was no apology, no follow-up explanation, no hint of guilt. Just polite interest, like we were distant relatives keeping up appearances. I locked my phone and carried my mug to the table, already aware that whatever I said next, or didn't say, would matter more than any confrontation ever could. As the day wore on, I found myself noticing patterns I'd ignored for years. The way holidays were always complicated. The way invitations came late, if they came at all. The way conversations ended the moment money entered the picture, as if that was the only language we'd agreed to speak fluently anymore. I'd always told myself this was adulthood, that relationships evolved, that parents learned to step back. But sitting there with that unanswered text, I couldn't avoid the uncomfortable truth that stepping back had turned into being sidelined. And worse, I'd been financing the arrangement with a consistency I'd mistaken for love. Around noon, Linda called again. She didn't ask about the birthday this time. She asked how I was doing, and the pause after the question told me she already knew something was off. I told her I was fine. I told her work was busy. I told her the usual things people say when they don't want to explain a fracture they've just discovered. She didn't push, but before hanging up she said, "You don't have to keep carrying things just because you always have." The line went dead after that, and I sat there longer than necessary, aware that someone else had just named the problem without knowing the details. That afternoon, I opened my banking app without quite admitting why. The recurring transfer stared back at me, familiar and unchallenged. I didn't touch it yet. I just looked at the history, scrolling back month after month, year after year. Tuition supplements, rent help, just-in-case money, emergency funds that had never really been emergencies. Each transaction carried a memory with it, not of gratitude, but of reassurance. Hers, not mine. I'd convinced myself this was how I stayed connected, how I remained relevant in a life that no longer had room for me in the foreground. Seeing those numbers lined up so neatly, I felt the first clear sense that relevance purchased this way came at the cost of dignity. That night, another external interruption came in the form of an email from my ex-wife. Short, carefully worded. "I heard you were disappointed about the birthday. I think there's been a misunderstanding." I didn't reply. I didn't forward it. I didn't even delete it. I just marked it as unread and closed my laptop, the implication hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. A misunderstanding suggested confusion, not intent. And by then, confusion was the one thing I no longer felt. The picture was becoming sharper by the hour, not blurrier. 2 days later, I finally responded to my daughter's text. Not with explanations or accusations, but with a single line. "I saw the photos." There was no immediate reply. Minutes passed, then an hour. I went about my evening routine with an odd sense of calm, as if something long overdue had finally been acknowledged, even if only silently. When my phone eventually buzzed again, it wasn't with a message from her. It was the bank app, reminding me of the upcoming transfer scheduled for the following week. I stared at the notification, aware that I was standing at the edge of a choice I couldn't unsee now. I didn't cancel it that night. I wanted to be clear about why, and clarity required restraint. Still, as I set the phone down and turned off the lights, I understood something that would guide everything that followed. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was preparation. And when I finally acted, it wouldn't be out of anger or spite. It would be because I'd finally accepted what the photos had shown me so plainly. I wasn't part of the celebration, only the infrastructure supporting it. And that realization, once made, doesn't fade. It demands a response. The confirmation screen asked if I was sure, and for a moment, I admired how neutral it sounded, like it had no stake in my answer. No judgment, no warning, just a simple question framed in clean fonts and muted colors. Cancel recurring transfer? I sat at the kitchen table with my phone resting between my hands, elbows planted, shoulders squared, breathing steady. I didn't feel rushed. I didn't feel angry. What I felt was resolved, in a way that surprised me with its quiet. I thought about how many decisions in my life had been made under pressure, shaped by urgency or guilt or the need to smooth something over. This one wasn't like that. This one had waited patiently for me to catch up to it. Before I tapped the button, I let myself think through it once, fully, without looping or spiraling. I wasn't punishing her. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I wasn't even asking for an apology. What I was doing was removing myself from an arrangement that had become lopsided enough to feel dishonest. The money had stopped being support and started being cover. Cover for avoidance, cover for imbalance, cover for the fact that my role in her life had narrowed to something transactional while being dressed up as generosity. I'd always told myself that as long as I gave freely, it didn't matter how often I was left out. Sitting there, I finally admitted how hollow that logic had become. I tapped confirm, watched the screen refresh, and saw the transfer disappear from the schedule. No alarms went off. The lights stayed on. The world didn't tilt. A small email arrived seconds later, polite and impersonal, thanking me for updating my preferences. I locked my phone and leaned back in my chair, feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been clenched for years. It wasn't relief exactly. It was alignment. The sense that my actions finally matched what I knew to be true. I stood up, rinsed my mug, and went about my day like I hadn't just dismantled a routine that had defined my relationship with my daughter for longer than I wanted to calculate. By the afternoon, the first missed call came through. I saw her name light up the screen while I was in a meeting and let it ring. When the voicemail notification appeared, I didn't listen to it right away. I finished my workday, drove home, and cooked dinner, letting the normal rhythm of the evening keep me grounded. Around 8, my phone buzzed again. A text this time. "Dad, did something happen with the bank?" The question was careful, almost tentative, and I recognized the tone immediately. It was the same one she'd used years ago when a credit card payment had been delayed or when a rent check arrived a day late. Concern, not curiosity. Fear, not confusion. I didn't answer that night. Not because I wanted to punish her with silence, but because I needed to hear what she'd say when the silence stretched. There's a difference between someone reaching out to connect and someone reaching out to restore a benefit, and time has a way of revealing which is which. Before bed, I finally listened to the voicemail. Her voice was strained, trying to sound casual and failing. She mentioned a glitch. She laughed once, nervously. She said she'd call me tomorrow. I set the phone down and turned off the lamp, already aware that the dynamic had shifted, whether she acknowledged it or not. The next day, the calls came earlier, 2 before noon. One from her number, one from her husband's. I ignored both. Around lunchtime, Linda texted me. "Everything okay? Your daughter just called me in a panic." I stared at the message longer than necessary, aware of how quickly the concern had traveled once money was involved. I typed back, "I'm fine. Just taking care of something that's been overdue." Linda didn't reply right away, and I appreciated that more than I could explain. It felt like respect, like she understood this wasn't something to be managed by committee. By mid-afternoon, my ex-wife joined the chorus. Her email was longer this time, less neutral. She suggested I was overreacting. She reminded me of how sensitive our daughter was. She hinted, not subtly, that financial stress could affect her marriage, her health, her stability. I read it once and closed it, noting how quickly concern for our daughter turned into a list of consequences I was expected to prevent. It occurred to me then that no one had asked why I'd been excluded, only why I'd stopped compensating for it. That realization hardened something in me, not into anger, but into resolve. That evening, the phone rang again. I was home, sitting in the living room. The same chair, the same lamp, the same quiet. I watched the screen light up with her name and answered before it could go to voicemail. She started crying almost immediately, words tumbling over each other. She said there must be a mistake. She said she had bills coming out. She said she didn't understand why the transfer hadn't gone through. I let her speak without interrupting, listening not just to what she said, but to what she didn't. She didn't mention the photos. She didn't mention my birthday. She didn't ask how I was. When she finally paused, waiting for reassurance, I told her calmly that there was no mistake. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It wasn't confusion. It was fear. She asked me what I meant, her voice thin now, stripped of its earlier urgency. I told her we'd talk soon, but not like this, not while she was panicking about numbers on a screen. I said we'd talk when she was ready to talk about everything, not just the part that affected her balance. She protested, her husband's voice faint in the background, but I ended the call gently, firmly, before it could spiral into something I'd regret. When the line went dead, I sat there for a long time, aware that the boundary I'd drawn was already doing its work. Later that night, as I got ready for bed, another bank notification arrived, not about a transfer, but about my updated balance. It was higher than it had been in years, not because I'd earned more, but because I'd finally stopped paying for my own absence. The thought startled me with its clarity. I realized then that this wasn't the climax, not even close. This was just the point of no return, the moment after which pretending would be harder than telling the truth. I turned off the light knowing the next conversation would be the one that forced everything into the open, and that once it happened, there would be no way to put things back the way they were. "Dad, something's wrong. My account is empty." Her voice cracked on the last word, like she hadn't meant to let the fear slip through so plainly. I could hear the echo of her kitchen behind her, the hollow sound of a room too big for panic. I didn't answer right away. I stayed quiet long enough for her to fill the space with breath and disbelief, long enough for the weight of that sentence to settle between us. In that pause, I understood something irreversible had already happened, not because the money was gone, but because the illusion that it was unconditional had finally collapsed. She kept talking, words stacking on top of each other, explaining bills, timing, automatic payments she hadn't checked because she never had to worry before. I listened without interrupting, my eyes fixed on the wall across from me, where a faint scuff mark still lingered from when she'd moved out years ago. Back then, I'd patched the hole myself and told her not to worry about it. That memory surfaced now not as nostalgia, but as context. I waited until she paused again, until the tears softened into sniffles, and then I told her calmly that there was no error, no glitch, no misunderstanding with the bank. The crying intensified immediately, sharper now, edged with confusion instead of fear. She asked me why I'd do this without warning, why I hadn't called first, why I'd let her find out this way. I noticed how quickly the questions turned inward, centered on her experience of the change rather than the reason for it. I told her we would talk, but not like this, not while she was spiraling through numbers instead of listening. That only made her more desperate. Somewhere in the background, her husband said my name, his tone polite but strained, like someone stepping into a conversation he thought he understood better than he did. When he took the phone, the shift was immediate. His voice was measured, careful, the way people sound when they think reason will fix what emotion can't. He talked about stress, about timing, about how this was probably a misunderstanding that could be cleared up quickly. He said they appreciated everything I'd done, past tense already slipping into his language. I let him finish, then told him this wasn't about appreciation or timing. I said it was about alignment. He went quiet at that, and after a moment, handed the phone back to my daughter without another word. That small retreat told me more than any argument could have. She asked then if her mother had something to do with it, her voice dropping as if the question itself carried risk. I didn't answer. Not because I was protecting anyone, but because I refused to let this become a triangle where responsibility could be passed around until it dissolved. I told her instead that we'd talk soon, properly, when she was ready to hear something that wasn't about restoring what she'd lost. She begged me not to do this, not now, not like this. I told her softly that the now was the point, that delaying the truth any longer would only make it harder for both of us. When I ended the call, my hand didn't shake. Afterward, the house felt different. Not heavier, but quieter in a way that felt earned. I sat in my chair and let the silence stretch without reaching for my phone or the television. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. What I felt was steady, like I'd finally stopped leaning against a door that had been slowly closing for years. I thought about all the times I'd stepped in early, smoothed things over, paid for peace without asking what it was costing me. This was the first time I'd let the discomfort land where it belonged. And I knew, even then, that this conversation was only the beginning. 2 days later, a package arrived at my door. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a framed photo of my daughter and me from years ago, one I remembered taking with my own camera. No note. No explanation. Just the image, carefully wrapped, like an offering. I set it on the table and stared at it for a long time, aware of the message being sent without words. This was her language now. Symbols instead of accountability, sentiment instead of acknowledgement. I didn't put the photo up. I didn't throw it away either. I slid it back into the box and placed it in the hall closet, where unfinished things tended to wait. That evening, my ex-wife called. I almost didn't answer, but I did, curious more than anything. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She accused me of being dramatic, of holding a grudge, of choosing money over my own child. She said I was punishing her for something small, something that had gotten blown out of proportion. I listened until she ran out of steam, then told her this wasn't about punishment. It was about honesty. I told her I'd been lied to, excluded, and expected to keep funding a version of family that no longer included me. She scoffed at that, dismissed it as hurt feelings. I ended the call before the conversation could turn into something uglier. Over the next week, the messages slowed. My daughter sent shorter texts, less frantic, more cautious. She asked if we could meet, if we could talk in person, if I'd reconsider just until things settled. I didn't respond immediately. I took my time, letting each request sit until the urgency drained out of it. I knew that whatever came next would define the boundary permanently, and I wasn't willing to blur it for the sake of comfort. I also knew that once I said the reason out loud, once I named the pattern instead of the incident, there would be no way to pretend this was just about money again. By the end of that week, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle in. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I'd stopped trying to resolve it on my own. I understood now that her tears hadn't moved me because they weren't about loss of connection. They were about loss of certainty. And certainty, I'd learned, was a poor substitute for respect. The next conversation would be the one where everything surfaced, where excuses met evidence, where silence gave way to truth. I wasn't dreading it anymore. I was preparing for it. I saw the photos, I said, and the silence on the other end of the line was so complete it felt engineered. Not a breath, not a shuffle, not even the faint static that usually lingered when someone held a phone too close to their cheek. I imagined her standing still, phone pressed to her ear, eyes darting the way they used to when she was caught between denial and explanation. I didn't rush to fill the gap. I'd learned by then that silence had a way of drawing truth out faster than accusations ever could. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, stripped of urgency, as if she were testing the ground before stepping forward. She started with the safest explanation first. It wasn't what it looked like. The trip had fallen through. Plans had changed last minute. Her mother had insisted they do something small at the house instead of letting the day pass unnoticed. She said she hadn't wanted to complicate things, hadn't wanted to disappoint me, hadn't wanted to create tension. Each sentence leaned heavily on intention rather than outcome, as if meaning well could erase the effect of being deliberately left out. I listened without interrupting, cataloging not just her words, but the order she chose to present them in. The lie had been rehearsed, smoothed down at the edges, but it still didn't hold. I told her I wasn't confused about what I'd seen. I described the details calmly, the timestamps, the location tag, the decorations that hadn't been there by accident. I mentioned the gift bags I recognized, the ones I'd bought in bulk years ago because it was cheaper that way. With every detail, her explanations grew thinner, more defensive. She shifted then, from denial to justification, saying she'd been trying to keep the peace, saying her mother had been fragile lately, saying it had felt easier to manage one disappointment instead of two. That was the moment the truth finally surfaced, not in her words, but in what they revealed. I had been the easier disappointment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I told her plainly that ease had come at my expense for a long time, and that this wasn't about one birthday or one lie. This was about a pattern where I was included only when my presence came with resources attached, and excluded when it required emotional consideration. I said it once, clearly, without circling back to it, because I'd promised myself I wouldn't repeat a realization just to soften its impact. I told her I'd been funding a version of family where my role had been reduced to support staff, not participant, and that I couldn't pretend anymore that it didn't matter. She cried again then, but differently. The tears weren't panicked this time. They were defensive, edged with indignation. She accused me of keeping score, of weaponizing generosity, of choosing money over love. I let her finish before responding, aware that this was the point where the conversation could either devolve into slogans or finally settle into truth. I told her love without respect wasn't love, It was leverage. I told her money had only entered the picture because it was the only place I'd been allowed to matter consistently. If she wanted to talk about love, then we had to talk about presence, honesty, and choice, not just comfort. An external interruption broke the tension. A notification chimed on my phone, a memory resurfacing from years ago. A photo of her and me at a diner, laughing over milkshakes, her arm looped through mine without hesitation. I didn't mention it. I didn't need to. The contrast sat heavy enough on its own. She asked then if this meant the money was gone for good, her voice small again, tentative in a way that suggested she finally understood the permanence of the shift. I didn't answer right away. I wanted the answer to land with intention, not reaction. I told her this wasn't a timeout. It wasn't a lesson. It was a boundary. I said I wasn't going to finance a relationship where I was optional, and that continuing the allowance would only reinforce a dynamic that had already done enough damage. I told her if she wanted me in her life, it had to be because she wanted me, not what I made possible. And if she didn't, then this was the honest alignment of circumstances. My voice didn't waver. I wasn't angry. I was clear. That clarity felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. She tried one last angle, softer this time. She said she was sorry if she'd hurt me. If. The word hung there, unclaimed. She asked if we could reset, start over, pretend this had never happened. I told her I wasn't interested in pretending anymore. I told her starting over required accountability, not erasure. That meant acknowledging the lie, the exclusion, and the years of quiet imbalance that had led us here. Until that happened, there was nothing to reset. There was only distance, and the work required to cross it. When the call ended, I didn't feel hollow. I felt grounded, like something heavy had finally been set down. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. No dramatic fallout, no immediate reconciliation, no sudden clarity on her end. Just space. Over the next few days, messages came in sporadically, short, careful, stripped of urgency now that the financial pressure had settled into reality. I read them without responding, not out of spite, but because I was done filling silence for other people's comfort. The boundary had been stated. The rest wasn't mine to manage. By the end of the week, I understood something that would have sounded cruel to my earlier self. Being excluded had hurt less than being tolerated. The photos had shown me where I stood, but the conversations had shown me why. I hadn't been invited because I complicated a narrative that worked better without me. And once I accepted that, withdrawing my support wasn't retaliation. It was self-respect finally catching up to reality. The final step was still ahead, the one that would make the boundary unmistakable. And when it came, there would be no anger in it. Only truth. I'm not in your life, I told her. So my money won't be either. I said it evenly, without emphasis, without the sharpness she probably expected. The words didn't need force. They carried their own weight. On the other end of the line, there was a quiet intake of breath, the kind that usually came right before she tried to negotiate. I waited, not because I wanted her to struggle, but because I wasn't going to interrupt the moment with reassurance anymore. This was the line, not a threat, not an ultimatum, a statement of alignment. And once spoken, it couldn't be softened without undoing everything that had led up to it. She accused me then of choosing money over her voice shaking but controlled, like she was clinging to a script she'd practiced in her head. I didn't interrupt. I let her say it fully, because I knew she needed to hear herself frame it that way before she could hear my response. When she finished, I told her quietly that she had it backward. I hadn't chosen money over her. I'd chosen myself over being erased. I told her I'd spent years confusing generosity with connection, assuming that as long as I provided, I belonged. But belonging that depends on payment isn't belonging at all. It's a contract where only one side ever signs. She tried to pivot then, to nostalgia, to shared history. She reminded me of vacations, of inside jokes, of moments that were real and warm and once mutual. I didn't deny any of it. I told her those memories mattered to me too, and that was exactly why I wasn't willing to keep pretending nothing had changed. I said love wasn't proven by how much discomfort one person could absorb to keep things pleasant for everyone else. Love required reciprocity, honesty, and presence. And right now, What we had was familiarity without accountability. I wasn't willing to fund that anymore. An external interruption cut through the call. A message alert from my ex-wife, arriving right on cue. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew its shape. Blame dressed as concern, urgency framed as reason. I told my daughter I wasn't interested in mediators or explanations filtered through someone else's comfort. This was between us. If she wanted a relationship with me, it had to be direct, not managed through avoidance or convenience. The allowance wasn't coming back. Not next month, not after apologies, not as leverage for good behavior. That chapter was closed. She asked then what I wanted, her voice quieter, more careful than it had been all week. The question surprised her as much as it surprised me. I told her I wanted honesty without strategy. I wanted invitations that weren't weighed against someone else's feelings first. I wanted to matter even when I was inconvenient. And until those things were possible, I was stepping back. Not out of punishment, but out of self-preservation. I told her distance wasn't abandonment when it was chosen to protect dignity. It was a boundary, and boundaries weren't negotiable just because they were uncomfortable. When the call ended, I didn't sit in silence this time. I stood up, opened the window, and let the evening air move through the room. The house felt lighter than it had in years, not because the situation was resolved, but because I'd stopped carrying a version of myself that existed only to be useful. Over the next few days, the fallout arrived quietly. My ex-wife stopped calling. Linda sent one message that simply said, "I'm proud of you." I read it twice and didn't reply, not because I disagreed, but because some acknowledgments didn't need commentary. A week later, my daughter sent a message. Short, careful. I understand more than I did before. I don't agree with everything, but I hear you. I didn't respond immediately. I let the words sit, felt their weight without rushing to fill the space. When I did reply, it was just as measured. That's a start. Take your time. I didn't add reassurance. I didn't promise anything. I wasn't closing the door, but I wasn't holding it open either. For the first time, the pace of whatever came next wasn't dictated by guilt or obligation. It was mutual, or it would be nothing. Months passed. The absence of the transfer became normal. My finances stabilized in a way that surprised me, not because I'd been struggling, but because I'd been quietly bleeding resources in the name of peace. Without that drain, I made different choices. I traveled. I invested time in friendships I'd neglected. I stopped explaining myself to people who only listened when there was something to gain. The relationship with my daughter didn't disappear, but it changed shape. Conversations were fewer, but more direct. When she visited, it was intentional, not assumed. And for the first time in a long while, I felt present without being purchased. There were moments of grief, of course. You don't draw a boundary like that without mourning what you hoped things would be. I missed the version of her who used to show up without calculation. I missed the simplicity of believing that effort alone could fix imbalance. But I didn't miss the feeling of being tolerated. I didn't miss the quiet resentment that crept in every time I paid for something I wasn't invited to share. Letting go of that cost me comfort, but it gave me clarity. And clarity, I learned, was worth more than access. Looking back now, I understand that the birthday wasn't the betrayal. It was the reveal. The photos didn't create the fracture, they exposed it. And cutting off the allowance wasn't revenge. It was alignment. I finally made my actions match my worth. I didn't do it loudly. I didn't do it to win. I did it because I'd reached the point where continuing as I was would have meant agreeing that my place in her life was optional, transactional, and conditional. I refused that agreement. If you've ever been excluded quietly, tolerated politely, or kept around only for what you provide, then you already understand how hard it is to draw a line without turning bitter. Standing up for yourself doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like silence, consistency, and finally refusing to fund your own erasure. If this story resonated with you, I'd ask you to like it. Not for me, but so it reaches someone who might still be questioning their worth. Share it with anyone who needs permission to choose self-respect. And subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, because no one should have to learn these lessons alone. See you soon in the next story.